This material is a quantitative and cultural audit attempting to calculate the exact monetary cost, estimated at $6 billion, of identity politics and progressive messaging across corporate brands, Hollywood, and gaming over the last decade.
The script's analytical ambition is hindered by a visible gap between the hard financial data presented and the subjective estimates used to isolate the ideological penalty.
Right.
The weakness here is that the material sets up a really compelling premise, a concrete ledger of financial losses, but the methodology for determining the conservative estimates is just never actually explained.
Yeah, I noticed that right away.
Like the material notes a $200 million loss for the Marvels, and even lists MCU fatigue as a mitigating factor. But then it unilaterally attributes like 100 to 150 million of that loss strictly to the movie being a corrective girl boss film.
Exactly, and we don't really see how they got there.
Right. Because the formula for stripping out the mitigating factors is completely absent. So the final $6 billion figure feels arbitrary rather than earned, which, really weakens the core thesis for any skeptical reader.
Well, let me push back on that a little bit.
Sure.
Because I wonder, is there a risk that demanding rigid financial modeling might ruin the fast-paced, entertaining momentum of an internet essay?
That's a fair question.
Like, does the target audience actually care about the rigorous math? Or are they simply there for the catharsis of seeing that massive $6 billion number?
I mean, they might be there for the catharsis, yeah. But the suggestion to fix this without losing momentum is to ground the conservative estimates in a defined, transparent methodology, or a comparative baseline to prove exactly how the final numbers are calculated.
Oh, okay. How would that look in practice?
Well, as a concrete example, you could establish a control group. The writer could briefly compare a heavily progressive flop mentioned in the text, like Strange World.
Right, the animated Disney one.
Exactly. Compare that to a traditional, non-ideological flop from the same studio in the same era. You use the baseline loss of the traditional flop to isolate the specific ideological penalty of Strange World.
So you're saying if a normal bad movie loses 50 million, but the progressive one loses 200 million, you can actually point to that 150 million difference.
Yes, exactly. It makes the math bulletproof. And the other example would be to just define the formula up front. Add a brief section early on explaining exactly how mitigating factors, like retail decline for Victoria's Secret, or the shifting design direction of Dragon Age, the Veiled Guard, are mathematically stripped out.
I see. So you just do the heavy lifting at the beginning.
Yeah, you show how you arrive at the final woke-attributed shortfall, so the reader trusts every number that follows.
That makes a lot of sense, which actually brings us to the next big issue because the friction between the objective financial audit framing and the highly charged polemical descriptions dilutes the script's persuasive power.
Oh, absolutely. This was so glaring.
Right? The weakness is that the author intends to present this devastating financial ledger, but they repeatedly use these highly subjective, emotionally charged phrases.
Yeah, like calling the acolyte a lesbian space witch fever dream.
Exactly. Or describing a Starfleet Academy character as a blue glitter-vomiting bisexual fishman.
I mean, it's funny, but it totally undermines the tone.
Exactly. While these phrases are punchy, they clash so hard with the market research angle. It makes the piece read like a culture war rant retrofitted with numbers.
Which will immediately alienate anyone who isn't already deeply entrenched in the author's viewpoint.
Right. It's like an accountant showing up to a board meeting to present a sobering Q3 loss report, but delivering it while wearing clown makeup and throwing pies.
That is the perfect analogy.
Like, the numbers might be mathematically accurate, but the delivery distracts entirely from the devastating reality of the ledger.
Yeah, so the suggestion here is to lean heavily into the corporate audit persona. Use devastatingly clinical, dry language to describe the absurd creative choices, and let the contrast do the persuasive work.
Give me an example of how you'd rephrase.
Sure. Instead of calling the acolyte a cringe-worthy watch for the lulz, you describe it clinically. You'd say something like, it was a $200 million space opera whose primary strategic pivot was centering a coven of immaculate conception space witches, a creative risk that fundamentally alienated the legacy demographic.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds so much more authoritative.
Right. You don't need to call it cringe. The clinical description of a massive corporate investment pivoting to something so niche highlights the absurdity all on its own.
What about the Doctor Who section? They mentioned the casting was a 2-time RuPaul Drag Race winner and complained about the mincing and scampering energy.
Right, so you frame that Doctor Who casting and aesthetic strictly in terms of ROI and target audience misalignment. You demonstrate how the product design ignored market realities without relying on inflammatory adjectives.
So you focus on the return on investment failing because they built a product the core audience didn't want to buy.
Exactly. It's so much harder for a critic to argue with dry financial realities than it is to argue with an insult.
Okay, so if the math is transparent and the tone is clinical, we have one more hurdle. The argument's durability is currently threatened by its tendency to treat ideological messaging as the sole fatal flaw, rushing past the massive structural shifts in the entertainment and retail industries.
Yeah, this is a massive blind spot. The weakness here is that the script briefly mentions mitigating factors like MCU franchise dilution, weak marketing, and pre-existing structural decline for Jaguar, but it just rushes past them.
Right, it almost treats them as footnotes.
Exactly. And a skeptical reader will immediately argue that Indiana Jones failed because legacy sequels are exhausted across the board, or that Concorde lost $150 million because the hero shooter market is hopelessly oversaturated anyway.
Yeah, it leaves the door wide open for the whole correlation does not equal causation argument.
Precisely. If you don't wrestle with those structural realities, people will just dismiss the ideology as a coincidence rather than the cause of the failure.
But let me ask you this. Is there a risk that by spending too much time acknowledging these massive structural industry failures, like shifting retail landscapes or the AAA gaming development cycle, we accidentally make the woke argument seem like just a minor footnote rather than the headline?
I don't think so. No, because the suggestion is to strengthen the thesis by actively engaging with the strongest counter-arguments head-on. You do this to prove why the ideological injection was the exact fatal blow that prevented a property from surviving a tough market.
Oh, I see. You use the tough market to prove how damaging the ideology was.
Exactly. Take Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny as an example. You concede the uphill battle of legacy sequel fatigue. You admit it was a tough market.
Right. Audiences are tired of the nostalgia bait.
Yes. But then you argue that the specifically progressive choice to demean the legacy hero in favor of a flawless successor removed the one element, pure nostalgia, that could have saved the $150 to $200 million loss.
That's a great point. Nostalgia was their only shield, and they threw it away for messaging.
Exactly. And you can apply the same logic to Concorde. You acknowledge that hero shooters are incredibly crowded and it's hard to break in.
Right.
Then you demonstrate how the hyper-curated, sterile, HR-coded character design actively repelled the exact core demographic needed to break into that crowded market.
So it wasn't just a tough market. The design choices turned what would have been a difficult launch into an immediate and terminal rejection.
Exactly. The ideology is what made the failure catastrophic.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Let's do a quick recap.
Sure.
The critique focused on maximizing the impact of this $6 billion financial audit by, first, making the methodology behind the estimates transparent.
Right. Establishing that control group so the math is undeniable.
Second, aligning the tone to be clinically devastating rather than purely polemical.
Yeah, using dry financial language to highlight creative absurdities. Put away the clown makeup.
Exactly. And third, bulletproofing the thesis by addressing industry-wide structural counterarguments head-on.
Right. Explicitly arguing why the progressive elements were the fatal blow in already struggling markets.
Exactly. We highly encourage the listener to take these actionable steps, revise the script, and submit it back to us for another critique. We'd love to see the next draft.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.